The room was still filled with white lilies when Joe Whitfield slid the document across the small table. Addison Whitfield was still wearing black from her father's funeral. "Just sign it," Joe said quietly. His mother, Carol, stood behind him. Mark Whitfield leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching. "It's only transferring the inheritance into the family account," Carol added. "Your father would want the family taken care of." Several relatives were close enough to hear. Addison held the pen. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. But what none of them knew, what no one in that quiet funeral room understood, was that this moment would later be reconstructed, line by line, document by document. And the truth would not be kind. If you believe silence is not weakness, stay with this story until the end. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if stories about dignity, truth, and quiet strength matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's begin at the beginning. The funeral for Thomas Whitfield took place on a gray Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. The church was older than most of the buildings around it, a red brick structure that had seen generations of families walk through its wooden doors during the worst days of their lives. The kind of place where grief moved quietly, like dust in sunlight. Addison Whitfield sat in the second pew. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers resting against each other, with the stillness of someone trying not to tremble. She wore a simple black dress and a thin silver necklace her father had given her years ago when she graduated from college. Most people in the church saw a quiet woman in mourning. What they did not see was the way Addison noticed things. It was an old habit. Addison worked as a compliance coordinator for a regional logistics company, an unremarkable title that mostly meant reading documents, carefully tracking details others ignored, and keeping records that might one day matter. Details had always mattered to her. Her father had taught her that. Thomas Whitfield had spent 30 years as an internal auditor for a manufacturing firm outside Columbus. His job had never been glamorous. It had been patient work numbers, reports, policies, signatures. But Thomas believed something deeply. Paper trails told the truth when people didn't. Addison had grown up hearing that sentence, and over time, she had learned to believe it too. At the front of the church, Pastor Daniel Morgan spoke gently about Thomas Whitfield, about a man who believed in steady work, honest accounting, and quiet responsibility. Several of Thomas's former co-workers sat together near the aisle. One of them wiped his eyes when the pastor mentioned how Thomas used to bring coffee for the entire department every Friday morning. Addison noticed that too. She noticed who had come and who had not. Joe Whitfield sat beside her, his posture, straight hands clasped together in what might have looked like solemn respect. Joe had always been careful about appearances. He worked in equipment sales, construction, machinery mostly, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he understood how the world worked. To most people, Joe seemed supportive. He rested a hand briefly on Addison's shoulder when the pastor finished speaking. But Addison noticed something else. Joe had checked his phone twice during the service. Just quick glances, subtle, but not invisible. Behind them sat Joe's family, Carol Whitfield. Joe's mother wore a dark navy coat and a pearl brooch that caught the light each time she shifted in her seat. Carol had a voice that could sound warm when she wanted it to, but there was always an edge beneath it. Next to her sat Joe's older brother, Mark Whitfield. Mark was broader, louder, the kind of man who filled rooms without noticing it. His wife, Linda, sat beside him, whispering occasionally and glancing toward Addison with the polite expression of someone who did not quite know what to say to grief. The service ended quietly. People stood hugged, shook hands, spoke softly. Addison accepted each gesture with the same small nod. She thanked Thomas's former colleagues. She thanked neighbors. She thanked a retired accountant who had once mentored her father. Every conversation blurred slightly at the edges, but Addison still noticed details. Who asked about the house? Who asked about the will? Who avoided those questions? Joe stayed close to her as they walked outside into the cold afternoon air. The sky was pale and flat, the kind of winter light that made everything look slightly drained of color. The burial would happen later that day. For now, the family gathered in the church reception hall where folding tables had been arranged with coffee and simple food. It was there that the first real conversation happened. Carol approached Addison with a sympathetic smile. "Oh, honey," she said softly, touching Addison's arm. "Your father would be proud of how strong you're being." Addison nodded. "Thank you." Carol glanced toward Joe, then toward Mark. It was a small movement, but Addison noticed. "We should talk about a few things soon." Carol continued gently. "Family matters. Nothing urgent, of course." Joe stepped closer. "It's just practical stuff," he said. "Things that are easier to handle sooner rather than later." Addison did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up a paper cup of coffee from the table and took a slow sip. Hot, bitter, normal. Normal things helped people think. "What kind of things?" she asked finally. Mark joined them now. "Well," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "the house for one." Addison looked at him. "The house, the one your dad left," Mark said. "Places like that can lose value if they sit too long." Linda added quickly, "We're just thinking about what's best." Carol nodded in agreement. "Families should make decisions together," she said. "That's all we mean." Addison listened. She did not interrupt. Joe spoke again. "Look, Addie," he said, using the nickname he preferred. "We'll figure everything out. We just want to make sure the money is handled responsibly." The word money hung in the air for a moment. Addison noticed something else then. Joe had said the word very easily. Too easily. Most people would hesitate to mention money on the same day as a funeral. But Joe had not hesitated at all. Addison placed the coffee cup back on the table. "My father only passed away 3 days ago," she said calmly. "Yes, of course," Carol replied quickly. "No rush." But Mark was already continuing. "We just mean it's good to start thinking ahead." Joe nodded. "Planning is smart." Addison studied each of their faces. She did not accuse them of anything. She did not raise her voice. But something inside her mind quietly marked the moment. The conversation ended there, at least on the surface. Later that afternoon, Addison stood beside the open grave as the casket was lowered slowly into the earth. The wind moved through the bare branches of nearby trees. Soil fell softly. A final sound. A final goodbye. Joe placed a hand on her back again. This time Addison did not move, because at that moment she remembered something her father had said to her only a few months earlier. They had been sitting at the small kitchen table in his house. Thomas had been reviewing some documents. "Addison," he had said casually, "if anyone ever rushes you to sign something important, that's your first warning sign." She had laughed then. "Dad, no one's going to rush me." Thomas had looked at her with a small smile. "Maybe not today." He tapped the paper in front of him. But someday, back at the cemetery, Addison watched as the last handfuls of soil covered the casket. Her father was gone, but his voice remained in her memory with perfect clarity. "If anyone rushes you to sign something important, that's your first warning sign." Addison Whitfield did not know yet how important those words would become, but she remembered them. And remembering things had always been her strength. 3 days after the funeral, the house Addison had grown up in felt both familiar and strangely distant. It stood at the end of a quiet street in Columbus, a modest one-story home with pale siding and a narrow front porch. The winter air carried the faint smell of cold soil and distant wood smoke. Addison unlocked the door slowly, the same way she had every Sunday for years when she came to visit her father. The hinges made the same soft creak. Inside the house still carried traces of Thomas Whitfield's routine. A coffee mug sat near the sink. The newspaper from the morning he went to the hospital remained folded neatly on the kitchen table. His reading glasses rested beside it. Addison stood there for a moment, her coat still in her hands, tucked into her sleeves. Grief did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came in quiet waves when familiar objects refused to move. She walked through the house slowly. Living room, kitchen, the hallway with framed photographs of birthdays and graduations. Her father's study sat at the end of the hall. That room had always been different. Thomas Whitfield believed in order. The desk inside was large, but rarely cluttered. Papers lived in folders. Folders lived in labeled drawers. Even the desk lamp had a precise place. Addison stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to sit in his chair. The leather creaked softly beneath her. She looked at the desk. Everything appeared exactly the same, but Addison knew better than to assume appearances meant anything. Her phone buzzed. A message from Joe. "Did you make it to the house?" Addison typed a simple reply. "Yes." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Good. Mom and Mark might stop by later to help you go through things." Addison paused before responding. "I didn't ask for help." Another pause. Then Joe replied, "They just want to support you." Addison set the phone down without answering. Support, she thought. That word had been used frequently over the last few days, often in conversations that eventually returned to the same subject: money. She turned toward the desk drawers. The top drawer held exactly what she expected: pens, a stapler, a small notebook Tommy used for grocery lists. The second drawer contained folders labeled in her father's careful handwriting: utilities, insurance, tax records. Addison slid out the tax folder first. Inside were several years of neatly arranged documents. Thomas had always believed taxes should be filed early and correctly. The third drawer held something more personal: old letters, greeting cards, a photograph of Addison at age 10 holding a fishing pole beside a lake. Her father stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder. Addison smiled faintly. Then she opened the bottom drawer. This drawer was locked. That was not unusual. Thomas Whitfield locked only 2 things in his house: his passport and important financial documents. Addison reached into her purse and removed a small key ring. Her father had given it to her during one of her visits the previous year, just in case, he had said. At the time, she had not thought much about it. Now she did. The small brass key slid easily into the lock. A soft click followed. Inside the drawer were 3 thick folders, one labeled estate documents, one labeled bank accounts, and one labeled property deed. Addison opened the estate folder first. Inside were copies of Thomas's will, along with contact information for his attorney, Daniel Reeves. The name was familiar. Thomas had mentioned him several times over the years. A careful lawyer, someone who believed paperwork should be done properly the first time. Addison continued reading. The will was straightforward. The house belonged entirely to her. So did the savings account Thomas had built over decades of quiet discipline. And a modest investment portfolio. Not enormous wealth, but enough to matter, enough to attract attention. Her phone buzzed again. "Joe, Mom says you shouldn't go through everything alone." Addison exhaled slowly. Before she could answer, another message arrived. "Mark is good with finances. He could help review the documents." Addison looked at the estate papers again. Then she typed, "I'm managing fine." 3 minutes passed. Then Joe called. Addison answered after the second ring. "Hey," Joe said. His voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. "You sure you're okay over there?" "Yes, Mom is worried about you. I'm working through some documents." Joe hesitated. "About that," he said, "we should probably talk about the inheritance." Addison leaned back in the chair. "What about it?" "Well, Joe said carefully, when people receive money like that, it's smart to plan where it goes." "It's already planned," Addison said. "My dad planned it." Joe gave a small laugh. "Sure, but things change once you're married." Addison did not respond immediately. Joe continued. "I mean, legally it may be yours, but practically it's part of our life together." There it was again. The same idea that had hovered quietly around every conversation since the funeral. Joe lowered his voice slightly. Look, Addie, we're a family. Money shouldn't sit in separate corners. Addison's eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the winter wind moved through the bare trees. Why are we discussing this today? She asked. Joe sounded surprised. What do you mean? My father was buried 2 days ago. Joe sighed. I know. I'm not trying to pressure you. But the next sentence came quickly. I just think we should handle things before paperwork gets complicated. Paperwork. Addison's gaze returned to the open folder in front of her. Her father had always believed paperwork clarified things. Joe seemed to believe it complicated them. That difference felt important. Joe Addison said quietly, Did you talk to my father about his will before he passed? There was a short silence. Then Joe answered, once or twice. When, a few weeks before he went into the hospital. Addison absorbed that. Her father had not mentioned such conversations. What did you discuss? Just general stuff, Joe said quickly. Nothing serious. Addison said nothing. Silence stretched across the line. Joe cleared his throat. Anyway, Mom thinks it would be smart to move the inheritance into a joint investment account. That way, everything is organized. Addison looked again at the document in front of her. The will was clear. Everything was left to her alone. Not jointly, not conditionally. Her father's signature sat at the bottom of the page, neat, confident. Addison spoke carefully. I'm not moving anything right now. Joe sounded mildly irritated. Addie, I'm just trying to help. I know. So why make it complicated? Addison closed the folder gently. Because sometimes waiting is the safest option. Joe exhaled through the phone. You're overthinking this. Addison did not argue. She simply said, we can talk later, and ended the call. The house returned to quiet again. Addison sat there for several minutes. Then she did what her father had always done when facing uncertainty. She began organizing information. First, she photographed each page of the will. Then she scanned the bank account documents. Then she created a digital folder on her laptop labeled simply Estate Records. Every file received a date. Every document received a note. Addison did not yet know why she felt the need to do this. But instinct told her something important. Conversations about money were beginning too quickly. Questions were arriving too precisely, and people seemed unusually eager to help her manage something that had only just become hers. As Addison Whitfield worked quietly at her father's desk, the winter afternoon faded slowly into evening. Lights turned on along the street outside. The house remained still. But somewhere in ways that had not yet fully revealed themselves, a conflict had already begun. And Addison was starting to document it. The next morning, Addison Whitfield woke before sunrise. The house she shared with Joe was quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed before the routines of the day began. The kitchen clock read 5:42 a.m. when she stepped inside, tying her robe loosely at the waist. She turned on the small lamp over the counter instead of the overhead light. Soft light helped people think. It had been another habit her father practiced, often never flood a room with light when you only needed enough to see the important things. Addison poured coffee into a mug and sat at the kitchen table. Her laptop opened in front of her. The folder labeled Estate Records was already growing. Scanned copies of the will, photos of the bank documents, a separate file containing the contact information for Daniel Reeves, the attorney her father had trusted. Addison had not called him yet, not because she doubted him, but because she believed something her father had told her many years ago. Before asking for advice, gather your facts. So she was gathering them. She opened another document and began writing a timeline. December 3rd, Dad admitted to hospital. December 6th. Joe asked about estate paperwork. December 12th. Funeral, December 15th. Discussion about moving inheritance to joint account. The dates were simple, but the pattern was not. Her phone buzzed softly beside the laptop. A text message from Carol Whitfield. Good morning, Addison. Joe said you were at your father's house yesterday. Addison stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed a neutral reply. Yes. Another message arrived almost immediately. You shouldn't handle those things alone. Mark knows a lot about investments. Addison watched the small typing bubble appear and disappear several times. Then another message arrived. Families should help each other with financial decisions. Addison placed the phone face down on the table. She did not respond. Not every statement required an answer. Some statements simply required documentation. She opened a new folder inside her timeline. Family messages. Then she took a screenshot of Carol's text. Saved. Timestamp visible. The coffee had cooled slightly by the time Addison finished organizing the messages. She took a sip and leaned back in the chair. Joe entered the kitchen 10 minutes later. His hair was slightly messy, his expression still soft with sleep. You're up early? He said. I couldn't sleep. Joe walked to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup. You went back to your dad's place yesterday, right? Yes? Joe stirred sugar into his coffee slowly. You find anything interesting? The question sounded casual. But Addison noticed something. Joe was not asking about memories. He was asking about discoveries. Just paperwork, she said. Joe nodded. Did you see the bank statements? Addison did not look away from him. Yes. Joe took a sip of coffee. How much is in the account? Addison let the silence linger for a moment. Then she asked a different question. Why do you want to know? Joe gave a small shrug. Because we're married. That's not what I asked. Joe set the mug down on the counter. Addie, come on. Addison remained calm. You asked about the amount before asking about anything else. Joe sighed. You're reading too much into this. Maybe she was. Or maybe she was simply paying attention. Joe leaned against the counter. I just think we should make smart decisions with it. What kind of decisions? Well, Joe said for starters the house. Addison already knew this conversation was coming. The house is mine now, she said. Technically, yes. Joe walked closer to the table. But practically, it's an asset that should benefit both of us. Addison closed her laptop. Her voice remained steady. What do you suggest? Joe looked relieved that she had asked. Selling it would be the easiest option. Addison waited. Joe continued. The market is still good. We could take the money and invest it. We? Joe nodded. Yes, us. Addison folded her hands on the table. My father left the house to me. And you're my wife. The sentence came out quickly, almost automatically. Addison noticed that too. Joe continued speaking, gaining confidence as he talked. Look, Mark and I have been discussing some opportunities. Addison's eyes lifted slightly. Opportunities? Joe nodded. Mark's construction business is expanding. He could use some capital. There it was, the real direction of the conversation. Addison spoke carefully. You want to use my inheritance to invest in Mark's business? Joe frowned slightly. When you say it like that, it sounds selfish. Is it incorrect? Joe hesitated. No, but that's not the point. Addison watched him. Joe ran a hand through his hair. Mark has a solid plan. This could benefit everyone. Everyone, yes. Addison leaned back slightly in her chair. And what happens if the business fails? Joe's expression hardened. It won't. That wasn't my question. Joe's voice sharpened slightly. Addie families support each other. Addison had heard that phrase twice already. Once from Carol, now from Joe. Patterns mattered. What kind of investment are we talking about? She asked. Joe shrugged. We haven't worked out the exact numbers yet. Have you already told Mark about the inheritance? Joe did not answer immediately. That silence gave Addison her answer. Joe noticed her expression change slightly. Of course I mentioned it, he said defensively. He's family. Addison nodded slowly, another note in the timeline forming quietly in her mind. Joe stepped closer. You're acting like this money is some kind of secret. It isn't. Then why not use it? Addison opened her laptop again. She clicked on the estate records folder. Her father's will appeared on the screen. Joe leaned forward slightly to read. Addison pointed to a line near the bottom. My father wrote this carefully. Joe glanced at the page. So he left everything to me directly? Joe frowned. Yes, no conditions. Joe crossed his arms. Okay. Addison met his eyes. He made that decision intentionally. Joe exhaled sharply. You're making this complicated. Addison closed the laptop again. Maybe? Joe stared at her for several seconds, and he spoke more softly. You don't trust me? The question hung in the air. Trust was not something Addison liked to answer quickly, because trust was not built from promises. It was built from patterns, and patterns took time. I trust actions, she said finally. Joe looked confused. What does that mean? It means I prefer decisions that make sense on paper. Joe shook his head. You sound like your father. Addison did not take that as an insult. Thomas Whitfield had spent most of his life teaching her something simple. When people became impatient about money, there was usually a reason. Joe finished his coffee and walked toward the door. We'll talk about this again tonight, he said. Addison nodded. Maybe. Joe left for work 10 minutes later. The house fell silent again. Addison reopened the timeline on her laptop. She added another entry. December 17th. Joe suggested selling house and investing inheritance in Mark's business. Then she paused. After a moment, she added another line. Joe confirmed he had already discussed inheritance with Mark. She saved the file. Outside the kitchen window, the early morning sun had finally begun to rise. The light moved slowly across the table. Addison Whitfield watched it for a moment. She still did not know exactly where the situation with Joe and his family would lead. But she knew one thing, with quiet certainty. The pressure was beginning. And she intended to keep a record of every step. 3 days later, Carol Whitfield suggested they visit Thomas Whitfield's house together. The idea arrived through a phone call that sounded, at least on the surface, thoughtful. Addison's sweetheart. Carol said, her voice soft, with the careful sympathy she often used when other people were listening. Your father's place must be overwhelming right now. Mark and Linda offered to help you sort through things. Addison stood in her living room, while Carol spoke, her phone balanced against her ear. I'm managing, Addison replied calmly. Oh, I'm sure you are, Carol said quickly. But houses collect so much over the years. Boxes, paperwork, old furniture. It would be easier with a few extra hands. Addison looked toward the window. Outside, the sky was pale and cold again. Maybe just a short visit, Carol added. We could all go together this afternoon. Addison hesitated. Her instinct was to say no. But another instinct, the one that had been quietly guiding her since the funeral, suggested something different. If people wanted to reveal their intentions, sometimes the best way to see them clearly was simply to let them talk. All right, Addison said. Carol sounded pleased. Wonderful. Joe can meet us there after work. The house felt different that afternoon when Addison unlocked the front door. Not physically different, but quieter in a way that felt protective. She stepped inside and waited. The others arrived 15 minutes later. Mark's pickup truck pulled into the driveway first, followed by Carol's sedan. Joe arrived last. He gave Addison a quick hug when he entered the house. You doing okay? Yes. Mark stepped inside behind him, looking around with open curiosity. So this is the place, he said. His voice carried the tone of someone inspecting a property rather than visiting a home. Linda followed him in offering Addison a polite smile. It's smaller than I expected, she said gently. Carol walked slowly through the living room, her eyes scanning the walls. Houses from this era always feel a bit tight, she said. Addison did not respond. The house had never felt tight to her. It had felt stable. Mark wandered toward the hallway. You started cleaning yet? He asked. Not much. Well, Mark said, rolling up his sleeves, let's take a look around. He walked toward Thomas Whitfield's study before Addison could answer. Addison followed. The study door was already open. Mark stood near the desk, glancing over the shelves. Your dad kept a lot of paperwork, he said. Yes. Mark pulled open one of the drawers. Addison spoke quietly. Please don't do that. Mark looked up. Relax, he said. Just curious. He closed the drawer halfway but didn't step away. Joe walked into the room then. "What's in here?" he asked. "My father's records." Joe nodded. "We should probably organize them." Addison leaned against the doorway. "I already started." Carol stepped inside behind them. "This room could be cleared out entirely," she said. "If the house is going to be sold, buyers prefer open spaces." Addison looked at her. "I'm not selling it." Carol blinked. "Well, not immediately," she said smoothly, "but eventually it would make sense." Mark turned from the desk. "Honestly, Addie, you could get a decent price for this place." Joe nodded. "We talked about that." Addison noticed the word "we" again. She walked to the desk and gently closed the drawer Mark had opened. "My father lived here for 37 years, she said. Linda glanced around the room. "It's just a lot of responsibility for one person." "Responsibility," Addison repeated. "Maintenance," Linda explained. "Taxes, repairs." Mark added, "And empty houses lose value fast." Addison watched each of them speak. Not one person mentioned memories. Not one person asked which items she might want to keep. The conversation stayed focused on the same topic: value. Joe leaned against the wall. "Addie, nobody is saying you have to decide today." Addison nodded. "I know." Carol clasped her hands together. "We're just trying to help you think ahead." Addison walked slowly to the bookshelf. Her father's books were arranged exactly as he had left them. Accounting manuals, local history volumes, a small collection of mystery novels he read on quiet evenings. She ran her finger along the spine of one book. Joe continued speaking behind her. "If we sell the house and combine the funds with the savings account, we could build a solid investment." Addison turned slightly, combined them where Joe hesitated for a moment. "A joint account." Mark nodded approvingly. "That way it's easier to manage." Linda smiled faintly. "And it benefits the whole family." Addison noticed something then. Mark's eyes had drifted back toward the desk, specifically toward the lower drawer, the one that had been locked before. "Is that where the bank papers are?" Mark asked casually. Addison stepped in front of the desk. "Yes." Mark's tone remained light. "Mind if I take a quick look?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Mark raised his eyebrows slightly. "Just trying to help." "I know." Joe stepped closer. "Addie, Mark deals with business finances all the time." Addison kept her voice even. "My father trusted his attorney to handle the estate." Joe frowned slightly. "You already talked to the lawyer. I have his contact information." Carol sighed softly. "Lawyers complicate things." Addison met her eyes. Sometimes they clarify things. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension into the room shifted slightly. Then Mark shrugged. "Suit yourself." He stepped away from the desk and walked back into the hallway. "Let's see the garage," he said. Joe followed him. Linda and Carol remained in the study with Addison. Carol lowered her voice. "Addison, I hope you don't think we're trying to take advantage of you." Addison said nothing. Carol continued. "You're part of this family." Linda nodded. "We only want what's fair." Addison looked at them quietly. "What does fair mean?" Carol blinked. "Well, shared responsibility and shared benefits," Linda added. Addison studied their expressions. Then she asked one simple question. "If my father had left the house to Joe instead of me, would we be having the same conversation?" Carol and Linda both hesitated. That hesitation answered the question. Footsteps sounded from the hallway. Mark returned. "You've got some tools out there," he said. Joe followed behind him. "Addie, we should really start thinking about next steps." Addison walked to the window. Outside, Mr. Howard Green, the elderly neighbor who had lived across the street for decades, was slowly raking leaves along the sidewalk. He glanced toward the house. Their eyes met briefly. Then he looked away politely. Inside the study, the conversation continued. Mark's voice carried a sharper tone now. "No offense, but sitting on money isn't smart." Joe added, "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." Addison turned back toward them. Handled by who? Mark answered quickly. By us. The word landed heavily in the room. Addison looked at each of them. Joe, Carol, Mark, Linda. 4 people standing inside her father's study. 4 people discussing what should happen to something that did not belong to them. Addison did not raise her voice. She simply said, I appreciate the concern. Then she walked to the door. But I'll manage my father's estate myself. Joe looked frustrated. We're trying to help. Addison nodded. I know. And that was the end of the visit. Or at least the end of what anyone in that room believed was happening. Because while the others gathered their coats and walked toward the front door, Addison Whitfield remained standing quietly in the study. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Desk, drawers, shelves, windows. Every detail exactly as it had been earlier that morning. Except for one small thing, the bottom drawer of the desk was slightly open, just half an inch. Mark Whitfield had been standing near it earlier. Addison stepped forward and closed the drawer carefully. Then she reached into her purse and removed her phone. She opened the Notes app and added another entry to the growing timeline. December 20th, family visit to house. Mark attempted to access desk records. She saved the note because something about the afternoon had become very clear. The Whitfield family had not come to help her clean. They had come looking for something, and Addison intended to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, Addison Whitfield drove to the bank. The building sat on the corner of a quiet street in downtown Columbus, its glass doors reflecting the pale winter sky. Addison had visited this branch before with her father several years ago, when Thomas Whitfield had insisted she learn how his accounts were organized. At the time, the visit had seemed unnecessary. Now she understood why he had wanted her to remember the place. Addison parked across the street and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. She wasn't nervous, but she was careful. The conversation at the house 2 days earlier had settled something in her mind. Joe and his family were no longer speaking about the inheritance in vague terms. They were asking specific questions. Questions about amounts, about access, about paperwork. Those kinds of questions usually came from people who believed the answers would benefit them. Addison stepped out of the car and crossed the street. Inside the bank was warm and quiet. A few customers stood in line near the tellers while a television mounted on the wall displayed muted financial news. Addison approached the reception desk. Good morning, the receptionist said with a polite smile. Good morning, Addison replied. I need to speak with someone about an account that recently transferred to my name through an estate. The receptionist nodded. Of course. One moment. A few minutes later, Addison was led into a small office with glass walls. A woman in her 40s sat behind the desk. Her nameplate read, Angela Martinez, Senior Account Specialist. Angela greeted Addison warmly. How can I help you today? Addison handed her identification and a copy of the estate paperwork she had printed earlier that morning. My father passed away recently, Addison explained. His accounts are in the process of transferring to me. Angela glanced through the documents carefully. I'm sorry for your loss, she said. Thank you. Angela typed something into her computer. Yes, I see the accounts here, she said after a moment. They were listed with you as the beneficiary. Addison nodded. I just want to make sure I understand how everything is structured. Angela turned the monitor slightly so Addison could see the screen. There are 2 accounts, she explained. A savings account and an investment account. Both are currently in transition, but will transfer fully to your name within the week. Addison studied the numbers on the screen. Her father had saved steadily for decades. The total amount wasn't enormous, but it was enough to change the direction of a life, if handled carefully. Angela continued. Right now, no one else has access to these accounts. Addison asked her first important question. If I were married, would my spouse automatically have access? Angela shook her head. No. Inheritance accounts are typically considered separate property unless you deliberately add another person or transfer funds into a joint account. Addison felt a small confirmation settle quietly in her chest. Her father had been right. Paperwork mattered. What if someone asked me to move the money into a joint account? Addison asked. Angela smiled gently. That would be entirely your choice. And if I did, then the funds could become shared assets? Addison nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Angela studied her expression for a moment. If you're unsure about anything, you don't have to make decisions immediately, she said. Accounts like these can remain separate indefinitely. Addison appreciated the calm tone. Can I request copies of the account history? She asked. Of course. Angela printed several pages and slid them across the desk. These show recent activity and account ownership changes. Addison scanned the documents carefully. There was nothing unexpected in the savings account. But something about the investment account caught her attention. A note near the bottom of one page. Account inquiry phone request logged 2 weeks prior. Addison looked up. Can you tell me who made this inquiry? Angela checked the system again. It was a general information request. Do you have the caller's name? Angela frowned slightly. It appears someone asked whether the beneficiary designation had changed. Addison felt her attention sharpen. Did they give a name? Angela read the log entry. The caller identified himself as Joe Whitfield. Addison sat very still. 2 weeks earlier. That was before the funeral, before the burial, before anyone had officially discussed the inheritance with her. Angela continued speaking. The employee who took the call explained that we couldn't provide details without authorization. Addison nodded. That makes sense. Angela added, no information was released. Addison believed her. Banks did not share financial details easily. But the inquiry itself mattered. Joe had already been investigating the account before Addison had even seen the paperwork. Angela handed Addison the printed records. If you ever want to place additional security measures on the account, we can do that. What kind of measures? For example, requiring in-person verification before major transfers. Addison considered that. Yes, she said. I'd like that. Angela updated the account settings. Done, she said. Addison placed the documents neatly into a folder. As she stood to leave, Angela spoke again. One more thing. Addison paused. If anyone pressures you to move inheritance money quickly, Angela said carefully, it's usually wise to slow down. Addison gave a faint smile. My father used to say something similar. Angela nodded knowingly. Good advice rarely changes. Addison left the bank and stepped back into the cold afternoon air. The sky had darkened, slightly clouds moving slowly across the city. She sat in her car again, placing the folder on the passenger seat. Joe Whitfield had called the bank 2 weeks earlier. The information settled heavily but calmly in her mind. It didn't prove wrongdoing, but it revealed something important. Interest, curiosity, preparation. Addison started the car and drove home. Joe arrived shortly after 6 that evening. He walked into the kitchen while Addison was cooking dinner. Hey, he said casually. Hi. Joe set his briefcase on the counter. Did you do anything interesting today? Addison continued stirring the pot on the stove. I went to the bank. Joe's head lifted slightly. Oh, I wanted to understand how the accounts work. Joe nodded slowly. That's smart. Addison turned toward him. The bank mentioned someone called 2 weeks ago, asking about the beneficiary. Joe froze for half a second. Then he recovered quickly. Oh, that was probably me. Addison watched him quietly. I was just checking some things. 2 weeks ago, Joe shrugged. I figured it would be good to understand the situation. Addison turned back to the stove. You didn't mention that before. Joe sounded defensive. It wasn't a big deal. Addison nodded slightly. Maybe it wasn't. But timing mattered. And Joe had started asking questions about her father's accounts before Thomas Whitfield had even been buried. Dinner that night passed mostly in silence. Joe spoke occasionally about work. Addison listened. But in her mind, another line had already been added to the timeline. December 6th, right? Joe contacted bank about beneficiary status. Later that night, after Joe had gone to bed, Addison sat at the kitchen table again. The folder of bank records lay open. She studied the documents carefully. Numbers, dates, notes, everything clear, everything quiet. And yet, something about the situation had begun to shift. Joe and his family believed they were guiding the conversation. They believed Addison was simply reacting. But in truth, Addison Whitfield had begun building something far more powerful than an argument. She was building a record. And records, when assembled carefully enough, had a way of revealing the truth, even when people tried very hard to hide it. 3 days after her visit to the bank, Addison Whitfield scheduled a meeting with the attorney her father had trusted for years. Daniel Reeves' office was located on the 3rd floor of a quiet brick building not far from the courthouse in downtown Columbus. The sign near the entrance read, "Reeves and Dalton Estate and Probate Law." Addison arrived 10 minutes early. She had always believed arriving early to important conversations gave a person time to observe things. The waiting room was small but orderly. 2 leather chairs faced a wooden coffee table stacked with legal magazines and estate planning brochures. A framed certificate from the Ohio State Bar hung neatly on the wall. Nothing in the room felt rushed. That alone reassured her. A receptionist greeted Addison and asked her to take a seat. A few minutes later, a tall man in his late 50s stepped out of the hallway and extended his hand. "Addison Whitfield," he said. "Yes, I'm Daniel Reeves. Your father spoke about you often." His handshake was firm, but not overly formal. "I'm sorry for your loss," he added. "Thank you." Daniel gestured toward his office. "Come in." The office was larger than the waiting room, but carried the same sense of quiet order. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with legal texts and neatly labeled case binders. Daniel sat behind his desk while Addison took the chair opposite him. He folded his hands calmly. "I handled your father's estate planning for almost 15 years, he said. He was a very careful man." Addison nodded. "Yes, he was." Daniel opened a file folder already sitting on his desk. "I assume you've reviewed the will." "I have. And everything appears straightforward, yes." Daniel studied her expression for a moment. "But something is troubling you," he said. It was not a question. Addison reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the desk. Inside were copies of several things she had collected over the past week. Screenshots of messages, notes from conversations, printed bank records. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began reading. He said nothing for several minutes. Addison watched the clock on the wall tick quietly forward. Finally, Daniel looked up. "Tell me about your husband," he said. Addison considered the question carefully. "Joe works in equipment sales," she said. "He's ambitious. He likes opportunities." Daniel nodded slowly. "And his family close," Addison said. Daniel gave a faint smile. That word can mean many things. Addison understood the meaning behind it. "They've suggested I sell the house and move the inheritance into a joint account," she said. Daniel leaned back slightly. "And how do you feel about that? I haven't agreed to anything." "Good." Daniel tapped the documents lightly. "Let's start with something important," he said. "Your father structured this estate very deliberately." Addison listened. "The house," Daniel continued, "transfers entirely to you." "Yes." "The savings account and investment account also transferred directly to you." Addison nodded again. Daniel folded his hands. "In legal terms, this is considered separate inheritance property." Addison had heard those words at the bank, but hearing them again from her father's attorney carried more weight. "What does that mean for my marriage?" she asked. "It means," Daniel said calmly, "that unless you voluntarily combine these assets with marital accounts, they remain yours alone." Addison felt the confirmation settle quietly inside her. Joe had implied something different. Daniel continued. "If you deposit the money into a joint account or use it to fund a joint investment, the legal classification can change." Addison understood immediately. "So once it's mixed," she said, "it's no longer separate, correct?" Daniel slid the printed bank record back toward her. "And based on this inquiry from your husband, it appears he's already thinking about access." Addison remained calm. "He said he was just asking questions." Daniel nodded. People often say that. He studied the timeline Addison had created. You documented these events yourself, yes. Daniel tapped the page with quiet approval. That's a very good habit. Addison felt a brief memory surface, her father sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of files. Write things down while they're still fresh. Daniel turned another page. These messages from your mother-in-law, he said. They're applying social pressure. Addison nodded. Family unity, shared responsibility. Daniel smiled faintly. Yes, I've seen that language before. He leaned forward slightly. Addison, I'm going to ask you a direct question. All right? Has anyone asked you to sign documents yet? Addison thought about the funeral reception, Joe sliding the paper across the table. Yes, she said. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. When the day of the funeral? Daniel exhaled slowly. What kind of document? I didn't read the full text. Joe said it would transfer the inheritance into a family account. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked genuinely displeased. That was extremely inappropriate, he said quietly. Addison did not react emotionally. She simply listened. Daniel continued. When someone asks a grieving beneficiary to sign financial documents during a funeral gathering, that raises serious concerns. Addison knew he was right, but hearing it stated so clearly made the memory sharper. What should I do now, she asked. Daniel answered immediately. Nothing. Addison waited. Specifically, Daniel said, do not sign anything. She nodded. Do not transfer any funds. Understood. And do not sell the property until you've had time to make a fully informed decision. Addison appreciated the simplicity of the instructions. Daniel closed the folder. One more question, he said. Yes. Do you feel pressured by your husband or his family? Addison considered the word carefully. Pressure did not always appear as shouting. Sometimes it appeared as polite persistence, repeated suggestions, friendly advice that returned again and again. Yes, she said finally. Daniel nodded. I suspected as much. He opened another drawer and removed a blank notepad. If the pressure continues, he said there are legal ways to address it. Addison watched him write a few short notes. For now, Daniel continued, the best thing you can do is exactly what you're already doing. Document yes. Daniel looked directly at her. Because situations like this often reveal their true nature over time. Addison understood. People who believed they were entitled to something usually became less careful the longer they pursued it. Daniel handed her a business card. If anything changes, he said, call me. Addison stood. Thank you. Daniel walked her to the door. Just before she left, he added one final thought. Your father was a very thoughtful man, he said. Addison paused. Yes, he was. Daniel gave a small nod. I suspect he anticipated the possibility of pressure after his passing. Addison felt the weight of that sentence. Thomas Whitfield had not been suspicious by nature, but he had been observant, very observant. As Addison stepped out of the office building and into the cold afternoon air, she felt something inside her settle into place. Until that moment, she had been reacting to events. Now she understood something clearly. Her father had prepared the legal framework. Daniel Reeves had explained the rules. And Addison Whitfield had already begun collecting the record. The pressure from Joe and his family had not ended. In fact, it was only beginning. But Addison was no longer uncertain about how to face it. She would do exactly what her father had always done. She would watch, she would document, and she would wait until the truth revealed itself completely. After Addison met with Daniel Reeves, something about the rhythm of her days began to change. Not outwardly. From the outside, life still looked ordinary. She went to work each morning at the logistics company where she had been employed for almost 8 years. She answered emails, reviewed compliance reports, and attended the same quiet meetings she always had. But internally, Addison's attention had sharpened. Her father used to say that when people wanted something badly enough, they eventually stopped hiding how they asked for it. Addison suspected that moment was coming. It arrived sooner than she expected. The first message came from Joe on a Monday afternoon while Addison was finishing a quarterly compliance report. The email subject line read, "Financial planning." Addison opened it slowly. Joe's message was longer than usual. "Addie, I've been thinking more about your dad's estate. I know the past couple weeks have been overwhelming, but I really believe we should start making some structured decisions. Mark and I talked through a few investment options. One of them involves moving the savings account into a family trust structure that we can manage together. This isn't about taking anything from you. It's about making the money grow in the smartest way possible. Let's talk tonight." Addison read the message twice. The wording was careful, calm, reasonable on the surface. But certain phrases stood out. Move the savings account, family trust, managed together. Addison clicked forward. The recipient field filled automatically. Daniel Reeves. She added a short note. Received today. First written proposal. Then she sent it. Her father had always insisted that written communication was valuable because written words rarely disappeared. 20 minutes later, another message arrived. This one came from Carol Whitfield. Not email, text message. "Joe told me you're hesitant about the investment plan." Addison placed her phone on the desk for a moment before replying. She typed a simple response. "I'm considering my options." Carol answered almost immediately. "Sweetheart, sometimes hesitation can cost opportunities." Addison watched the words appear. Another message followed. "Families succeed when everyone contributes." Addison took a screenshot, saved it. Then she placed the phone back down without replying again. By the time Addison arrived home that evening, Joe was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. "Hey," he said as she walked in. "Hi," Joe looked relieved. "I sent you an email earlier." "I saw it." Joe turned the laptop so she could see the screen. A document filled the display. Title at the top, Whitfield Family Investment Structure. Addison read silently. The document outlined a proposed financial plan. Step 1, sell the Columbus house. Step 2, transfer inheritance funds into a joint investment trust. Step 3, allocate part of the capital to Mark's construction expansion project. Joe spoke while she read. "Mark has been researching this for weeks." Addison noticed the word again. Weeks. Before the funeral, before the burial, before anyone had officially discussed the inheritance. "Where did this document come from?" Addison asked. "Mark drafted it." Addison continued reading. Several sections discussed projected returns, estimated growth, family equity distribution. But one detail stood out. Joe Whitfield listed as primary trust manager. Addison looked up. "You would control the trust." Joe nodded. "Someone has to manage it, and Mark he would handle the construction investment side." Addison studied his expression. Joe seemed confident, certain, as if the decision had already been made. "You've put a lot of work into this," Addison said. Joe smiled. "Because I care about our future." Addison closed the laptop gently. "I'm not moving the inheritance." Joe's smile faded. "Addie, you haven't even thought about it." "I have." Joe leaned back in his chair. "You're being defensive. I'm being careful." Joe rubbed his forehead. "Why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" Addison's voice remained calm. "Because once the money moves, it can't move back." Joe stared at her. "It's not your money alone anymore." Addison did not react emotionally, but she did notice the phrasing. "My father left it to me," she said, "and you're my wife." The argument had circled back to the same point: marriage, shared assets, family. Joe leaned forward. "Addie, we're not strangers." "No." "Then why act like I'm trying to steal something?" Addison looked at him for a moment before answering. "I'm acting like someone who hasn't made a decision yet." Joe exhaled sharply. "Mom says you're isolating yourself." Addison did not respond. Joe continued. "She thinks grief is clouding your judgment." Addison noticed something then. Joe had begun using other people's voices to reinforce his arguments. "Mom says. Mark thinks. Everyone agrees." That technique worked well in families, but it did not change paperwork. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Mark. Addison opened it. Joe told me you're unsure about the trust. Look, Addie, this is a great opportunity. Construction projects are exploding right now. If we move quickly, we can triple the return. Addison read the message without expression. Then she placed the phone face down on the table. Joe watched her. Well, Addison stood. I'm making dinner. Joe's frustration surfaced more clearly now. You're avoiding the conversation. No, Addison said. I'm postponing it. Joe shook his head. This is exactly what Mom warned me about. Addison paused. What did she warn you about? Joe hesitated. Nothing. But the sentence had already revealed something important. Carol Whitfield had been discussing Addison's behavior with Joe privately, planning arguments, preparing explanations. Addison placed a pot on the stove and turned on the burner. Behind her, Joe continued speaking. You're acting like we're your enemies. Addison stirred the pot slowly. I'm acting like someone who reads documents before signing them. Joe stood. Fine, he said sharply. Take all the time you want. He walked out of the kitchen. A moment later, Addison heard the bedroom door close down the hall. The house fell quiet again. Addison finished cooking dinner. She ate alone at the kitchen table. When she finished, she opened her laptop. The folder labeled Estate Records had grown larger. Inside, she added 3 new files. Joe_email_financialplanning.pdf. Carol_text_familycontribution.png. Mark_text_construction opportunity.pn. Each file received a timestamp. Each file received a note. Addison leaned back in her chair and reviewed the timeline she had built. The pattern was becoming clearer. First came the conversations, then the suggestions, then the written proposals. The requests were becoming more structured, more specific, and more urgent. Daniel Reeves had been right about something. Pressure revealed itself over time. And Addison Whitfield was beginning to see exactly how determined Joe and his family were to gain control of the inheritance. What they did not realize was something far more important. Every message they sent, every document they shared, every argument they made, was quietly becoming part of a record. And records once complete enough had a way of telling the full story, even when the people inside that story believed they were still in control. Carol Whitfield arranged the dinner for the following Saturday. She presented the idea as something simple. A family conversation, she said over the phone earlier that week. Nothing formal, just dinner together so we can clear the air. Addison knew immediately what the evening would be about. The inheritance. But she agreed anyway. By now she had learned something important about the Whitfield family. When they believed they were persuading someone successfully, they talked more than usual. And when people talked too much, they often revealed more than they intended. Carol's house sat in a quiet subdivision outside Columbus. It was larger than Addison's father's home, with wide windows and a polished front porch light glowing against the early winter darkness. Joe drove them there just before 6. The car ride had been mostly silent. Joe seemed calmer than he had earlier in the week, but Addison recognized the kind of calm that often came from believing a conversation had already been planned in advance. When they entered the house, Mark and Linda were already there. Carol greeted them warmly. "There you are," she said, embracing Joe, and then Addison with a gentle touch on the shoulder. Dinner had been arranged carefully. The dining table was fully set. Plates, wine glasses, cloth napkins folded neatly beside polished silverware. Carol believed in presentation. Addison noticed every detail as she sat down. Carol at the head of the table, Mark and Linda on one side, Joe beside Addison on the other. The arrangement itself felt deliberate. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Carol spoke about neighborhood news. Linda mentioned a new grocery store opening nearby. Mark described a construction project he was working on downtown. Addison listened quietly. Occasionally, she answered simple questions about work. For almost 30 minutes, no one mentioned the inheritance. But Addison knew the topic would arrive eventually. It always did. The shift came when Carol set her wine glass down gently and folded her hands together. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose we should talk about the situation." Joe nodded slightly. Mark leaned back in his chair. Linda glanced briefly toward Addison. Carol's voice carried the careful tone of someone about to deliver a prepared message. "Addison," she began, "we know the past few weeks have been incredibly difficult for you." Addison nodded once. Carol continued, "And we all want to support you as you move forward." Joe added quietly, "That's what this dinner is about." Addison waited. Carol looked toward Mark. Mark cleared his throat. "The construction expansion we talked about earlier," he said, "is moving fast." Addison had expected this. "Several investors are already involved," Mark continued, "but we're still short on capital." Joe leaned forward slightly. That's why the inheritance could make such a difference. There it was. Direct, unmistakable. Addison set her fork down. "You want to use my inheritance for the construction project?" Mark nodded. "It's not just about the project," Joe added quickly. "It's about building something for the family." Carol's voice softened again. "Think of it as your father's legacy, helping create a future for all of us." Addison noticed the phrasing. Legacy, future, family. Words designed to feel noble. But beneath them lay a simpler truth. Money. She asked a calm question. "How much capital does the project require?" Mark answered immediately. 200,000. The number landed quietly on the table. Addison did not react outwardly. But she noticed something. Joe did not look surprised. Neither did Carol. The figure had clearly been discussed before this dinner. "How much have other investors committed?" Addison asked. Mark hesitated briefly. "About half. So you need the other half." Mark nodded. Joe spoke again. "If we move the inheritance into the trust structure I showed you, the funds can be allocated easily." Addison looked at him. "You've already structured the plan." "Yes. Without my agreement." Joe shifted slightly. "We assumed you'd see the opportunity." Linda leaned forward gently. "Addison, this could really change everyone's lives." Carol nodded. "And your father would be proud, knowing his savings helped build something meaningful." Addison remained silent for several seconds. Silence made people uncomfortable. Eventually, Mark spoke again. "Look," he said, his tone slightly sharper now. "Money sitting in a savings account doesn't do much." Addison met his eyes. "It grows slowly, exactly. And slowly is sometimes safer." Mark shook his head. "You're thinking too small." Joe placed his hand lightly on the table. "Addie, we're not asking you to give the money away. You're asking me to risk it," Joe sighed. "All investments involve risk." Addison turned toward him. "Are you personally guaranteeing the loan?" Mark laughed softly. "That's not how business works." Addison asked another question. "If the project fails, what happens to the investment?" Mark's expression tightened slightly. "It won't fail. That's not the question I asked." Joe looked uncomfortable now. "Addie, you're interrogating us." Addison shook her head gently. "I'm asking the same questions any investor would ask." Carol leaned forward. "This isn't a corporate boardroom." "No," Addison agreed. "It's a financial proposal." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mark said something that changed the tone of the evening. "You're acting like we're trying to take advantage of you." Addison did not answer immediately. Mark continued, "You married into this family." Joe added quietly, "We thought you trusted us." Addison studied their faces. Trust again. It was always the same argument. Trust without documentation. Trust without guarantees. Trust without safeguards. She asked one final question. "When did you start planning this investment?" Mark looked confused. "What do you mean you said earlier that you've been discussing it for weeks?" Joe shifted in his chair. Mark answered quickly. "Well, the expansion has been in development for a while." Addison's voice remained calm. "Before my father passed away, no one answered immediately. That silence was enough. Joe finally said, 'We knew the inheritance would eventually come into the picture.' Addison felt the room grow very still. Her father had been alive when they started planning how to use his money. Carol tried to smooth the moment. Everyone knew Thomas wanted Addison to be secure. Mark added defensively, "This isn't about your father." But Addison understood something clearly now. It had always been about her father's money. Joe leaned closer. "So what's your answer?" Addison looked around the table. 4 people watching her carefully, waiting, expecting. She spoke quietly. "My answer is no." The words settled into the room like a stone dropping into still water. Joe stared at her. "You're serious, yes?" Mark leaned back with visible frustration. "You're making a mistake." Carol sighed softly. "Addison families make sacrifices for each other." Addison stood from the table. "I'm not sacrificing my father's inheritance." Joe's voice sharpened. "You're being selfish." Addison paused. Then she said something simple. "I'm being responsible." She picked up her coat. "I think it's time to go home." Joe hesitated for a moment before standing as well. The drive back was silent again. But this silence felt different. Heavier, more certain. Back at their house, Joe went straight to the bedroom without speaking. Addison remained in the kitchen. She opened her laptop. The timeline appeared again. She added a new entry. December 23rd, family dinner. Mark requested $200, 000 investment. Proposal declined. Then she added another note beneath it. Joe confirmed investment planning began before Thomas Whitfield's death. Addison closed the laptop slowly. The evening had revealed something important. The Whitfield family was no longer simply suggesting ideas. They were expecting cooperation, expecting compliance. And now that Addison had refused them openly, the situation was likely to change. Pressure did not disappear when denied. It usually intensified. And Addison Whitfield suspected that the most revealing moments of this story were still ahead. The week after the dinner at Carol Whitfield's house felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Joe still went to work each morning. He spoke politely when necessary, but the warmth in his voice had faded into something cooler and more distant. Conversations between him and Addison became short and practical. Weather, groceries, work schedules. The inheritance was not mentioned again, but Addison knew silence did not mean acceptance. Silence often meant planning. On Wednesday evening, Addison sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reviewing the bank documents she had collected earlier in the week. A small desk lamp cast a soft circle of light across the pages. The folder labeled Estate Records had grown thick with information. Emails, screenshots, notes. Every piece of communication from Joe or his family had been saved and organized carefully. Her father had always said that records mattered most when they were assembled before anyone realized they were being kept. Addison opened the bank statements again. She had looked at them twice already, but something about them still bothered her. At first glance, the documents simply confirmed the inheritance accounts were untouched. The savings account had not been accessed since her father's passing. The investment portfolio remained exactly as it had been. But Addison was not only reviewing her father's accounts anymore. She was reviewing something else, Joe's financial behavior. Earlier that week, while organizing household documents, she had opened the drawer where Joe kept his monthly statements for the joint checking account they shared. She had not searched through them aggressively. She had simply noticed patterns that now seemed worth examining more carefully. Addison opened the joint account records on her laptop. Several transactions stood out immediately. Large transfers, repeated payments, some labeled clearly, others less so. One payment in particular appeared 3 times in the past 6 months. Whitfield Construction Consulting, $4,500. Addison stared at the line for a moment. Whitfield Construction Consulting, Mark Whitfield's business. She clicked open the full statement. 3 payments, each separated by roughly 2 months. Total $13,500. Addison leaned back in her chair. Joe had told her only recently that Mark's expansion project needed capital. But the statement suggested something else. Joe had already been sending Mark money. Quietly, repeatedly. She opened another statement. More payments appeared. Smaller amounts, but consistent. Addison began creating a new document, Household Financial Timeline. She typed the first entry, June 4th, $4.500 transfer to Whitfield Construction Consulting. Then the second, August 11th, $4.500 transfer, then the third. October 17th, $4.500 transfer. Addison looked at the dates. Months before Thomas Whitfield's death. Joe had been financially supporting Mark's business long before the inheritance conversation began. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Reeves. Addison opened it immediately. Received your forwarded emails. Document everything. If additional written proposals arrive, save them. She typed a quick reply. Understood. Then she returned to the statements. Another pattern emerged. Credit card balances. Joe's personal credit card had increased significantly over the past year. Addison opened the latest statement. Balance $41,280. Her breath slowed slightly. That was far higher than she had expected. Joe had never mentioned debt anywhere near that amount. She continued reading. Many of the charges were ordinary. Travel, restaurants, equipment purchases related to work. But several large payments had gone directly to Mark's company. Another connection. Addison added another line to the timeline. Joe credit card balance increased significantly during same period as transfers to Mark's business. She sat quietly for several minutes studying the pattern. Joe's financial situation was not simply tight. It was strained. Mark's business appeared to be absorbing money from multiple directions, which meant the proposal at the family dinner had not been about opportunity. It had been about relief. The inheritance represented a solution to financial pressure that had already existed for months. Addison closed the laptop for a moment and stared at the kitchen wall. Her father's words drifted back into memory again. People reveal their priorities through their transactions. Thomas Whitfield had believed that financial behavior told a clearer story than when promises ever could. The house door opened. Joe walked in. He looked tired. "Hey," he said. "Hi." Joe dropped his keys on the counter. "Long day." Addison nodded. "Dinner's in the fridge." Joe opened the refrigerator and pulled out a container. He placed it in the microwave and leaned against the counter while it heated. After a moment, he glanced toward the table. "You working on estate stuff again?" "Yes." Joe seemed uninterested. That must be exhausting. Addison watched him quietly. "Joe," she said. "Yeah, how is Mark's construction project going?" Joe paused. "Fine, I think. You've been supporting it for a while." Joe's expression changed slightly. "What do you mean?" Addison turned the laptop toward him. The bank statement remained open. Joe looked down at the screen. The payment line sat clearly in the center of the page. Whitfield Construction Consulting, $4.500. Joe frowned. "You went through the statements?" "Yes." Joe straightened. "That's from the joint account?" "Yes." "So it's our money." Addison remained calm. "You never mentioned sending Mark that much." Joe's voice tightened. "It's just temporary support. 3 payments." Joe crossed his arms. Mark needed help stabilizing the project. Addison waited. Joe added quickly, "He's paying it back." Addison asked quietly, "Has he?" Joe did not answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than anything else. Joe looked frustrated now. "Why are you digging into this? I'm trying to understand the investment proposal." Joe shook his head. "You're acting like an auditor." Addison almost smiled. "That's how my father approached money." Joe rubbed his temples. "Look, Mark's project is going to work out. That's not what the numbers suggest." Joe stared at her. "You don't trust my family." Addison did not answer directly. Instead, she said, "Your credit card balance is over $40,000. Joe's eyes widened. "You went through that too." "It's on the household statements." Joe looked away. "That's temporary." Addison remained calm. "Does Mark know about the debt?" Joe didn't respond. Addison felt the final pieces of the puzzle begin to align. Joe and Mark were both under financial pressure. The construction project needed capital. Joe had already been sending money he couldn't easily afford. And now the inheritance represented a solution. A large solution. Joe finally spoke again. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Addison closed the laptop. "I'm documenting reality." Joe laughed bitterly. "Of course you are." He picked up his plate of food and walked toward the living room. "Enjoy your spreadsheets," he said. The television turned on a moment later. Addison remained at the table. She reopened the laptop. The timeline had become much longer, but the story inside it was becoming clearer. Joe's family had not suddenly developed interest in her father's inheritance. They had been moving toward it for months. The dinner, the emails, the investment proposal. None of it had been spontaneous. It had been part of a plan, and Addison Whitfield was beginning to understand just how much pressure that plan had been designed to relieve. What Joe did not yet realize was that every financial transaction he had made, every email he had sent, every argument he had delivered at the dinner table, was quietly building the evidence Addison might one day need. Because numbers had a way of revealing truths that words tried to hide. And the numbers were beginning to tell a very different story than the one Joe Whitfield had been trying to sell. 2 days after Addison finished reviewing the bank statements, Daniel Reeves called her. The call came late in the afternoon while Addison was still at work. She stepped into a small conference room to answer it, closing the door behind her. "Hello, Mr. Reeves." "Daniel is fine," he said in his usual calm voice. "Do you have a few minutes?" "Yes. I've reviewed the documents you sent earlier this week," he said. "The financial timeline you created is very helpful." Addison sat down at the conference table. "I wanted to ask about something else." Daniel continued. "When your father finalized his estate paperwork last year, he left a sealed document with instructions that it be delivered to you after his passing." Addison felt a small shift in her chest. "A document, yes. I kept it with the estate file. Normally I would have sent it sooner, but I wanted to wait until you had time to settle after the funeral." "What kind of document is it?" Daniel paused briefly. "A personal letter." Addison looked at the empty chair across from her. "From my father?" "Yes." The words felt strangely heavy. Daniel continued. "Your father asked that I give it to you personally. Can I come by your office, of course?" They agreed to meet the next morning. Daniel Reeves' office looked exactly the same as it had a week earlier. The same quiet shelves, the same neat desk. But this time, a single envelope sat in the center of the desk. Daniel gestured toward it as Addison entered. "Your father left this with me 12 months ago." The envelope was plain, cream-colored, Addison's name written on the front in Thomas Whitfield's steady handwriting. She recognized the pen immediately. Her father always used the same blue fountain pen for important documents. Daniel remained silent as Addison sat down. She ran her finger lightly across the edge of the envelope before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her father's handwriting filled the page. Addison began to read. Addison. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer here to have this conversation with you directly. That thought bothers me more than I can easily explain. But life does not always give us the chance to finish every discussion we begin, so I'm writing this now. Addison paused for a moment before continuing. You have always been careful with money. I'm proud of that. But money itself is never the real challenge. People are. Addison felt her throat tighten slightly. Over the years, I've noticed that when people learn someone has received an inheritance, their behavior often changes. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it begins with advice. Sometimes with opportunities. Sometimes with pressure disguised as concern. Addison continued reading slowly. You are a thoughtful person, but thoughtful people can also feel responsible for everyone else's problems. Please remember this. You are not responsible for solving financial difficulties that belong to other adults. Addison took a slow breath. The letter continued. If anyone encourages you to move quickly with decisions about the estate, wait. If anyone asks you to sign documents before you fully understand them, wait. If anyone tells you that family loyalty requires financial sacrifice, wait. Time has a way of revealing intentions. Addison felt her father's voice echo in each sentence. Patient, practical, steady. The final paragraph was shorter. I trust your judgment, but I also know that grief can make decisions feel urgent. There is no urgency. Protect what you've been given until you are absolutely certain what should be done with it. Love, Dad. Addison lowered the letter slowly. The room was quiet. Daniel Reeves watched her carefully. He wrote that shortly after finalizing the will, Daniel said. Addison nodded. He expected pressure. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Your father was very perceptive. Addison folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Did he say anything else about why he wrote it? Daniel considered the question. He mentioned that he had observed tension between your husband's family and financial boundaries. Addison was not surprised. Thomas Whitfield had always paid attention to the details other people ignored. Daniel continued. He also believed that documentation protects people from misunderstandings. Addison almost smiled. That sounds like him. Daniel nodded. Yes. He slid another small folder across the desk. This contains copies of the estate documents in case you need them. Addison accepted the folder. Thank you. Daniel studied her expression. May I ask how things are progressing at home? Addison considered how to answer. They're becoming more direct. Daniel was not surprised. That usually happens once initial persuasion fails. Addison told him about the dinner at Carol's house, the investment proposal, the request for $200,000. Daniel listened carefully. And your husband confirmed the planning began before your father passed away? Yes. Daniel tapped his pen lightly against the desk. That detail is important. Addison understood why. It suggested intention, preparation, expectation. Daniel spoke again. For now, the best course remains the same. Document everything. Yes. Addison stood. She slipped the envelope containing her father's letter into her bag. As she prepared to leave, Daniel added something else. If the pressure escalates, there are legal options available. Addison nodded. I hope it doesn't come to that. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful look. So do I. When Addison returned home that evening, Joe was already there. He sat on the couch watching television. Hey, he said when she walked in. Hi. Joe glanced toward her bag. Busy day, yes. Addison hung her coat and walked into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water. Joe followed her a moment later. What did you do today? Addison turned toward him. I met with my father's attorney. Joe's expression changed slightly. Why to review the estate documents? Joe crossed his arms. You already know what they say? Yes. Then what's the point? Addison considered the envelope inside her bag. My father left a letter for me. Joe's eyebrows lifted. A letter? Yes. What did it say? Addison looked at him for a moment. It said to be careful. Joe frowned. Careful about what financial decisions? Joe let out a short laugh. Of course he did. Addison waited. Joe continued. He never trusted my family much. Addison did not respond. Joe walked back toward the living room. Well, he said you can't live your whole life waiting for problems that might never happen. Addison watched him go. Then she returned to the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She added another entry to the timeline. Letter from Thomas Whitfield received advised caution regarding financial pressure. Then she sat quietly for a moment. Her father had written the letter a year earlier, long before the dinner, long before the emails, long before Joe's family began pushing for access to the inheritance. But the message inside it had predicted almost everything. Advice, opportunity, pressure disguised as concern. Addison closed the laptop slowly. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of clarity settle in her mind. Thomas Whitfield had not left her only money. He had left her preparation. And now the situation with Joe and his family was beginning to unfold exactly as he had expected. What Addison did not yet know was that the next stage of that pressure would reveal even more than the conversations before it. Because people who believed they deserved something often made their biggest mistakes when they thought time was running out. The shift began quietly. For almost a week after Addison told Joe about the letter from her father, no one in the Whitfield family mentioned the inheritance again. Joe remained distant but polite. Carol did not send messages. Mark did not bring up the construction project. At first glance, it looked like the pressure had faded. But Addison had already learned that silence often meant something else. Preparation. The first sign appeared in the form of an email. It arrived on a Monday afternoon while Addison was reviewing a compliance report at work. The sender was Joe. The subject line read, "Financial clarification." Addison opened the message slowly. "Addie, I think we need to resolve the inheritance situation soon. This tension between us isn't healthy for the marriage. I spoke with a financial advisor who confirmed that married couples usually integrate assets for long-term stability. We need to sit down tonight and finalize a plan." Addison read the message carefully. The language had changed. Joe was no longer talking about opportunities. He was talking about resolution and urgency. She forwarded the email to Daniel Reeves without adding a comment. Then she returned to her work. When Addison arrived home that evening, Joe was waiting in the living room. He stood when she entered. "Can we talk?" Addison set her bag down. "Yes." Joe walked into the kitchen and pulled a chair away from the table. "Sit down," he said. His voice sounded controlled, but the tension beneath it was obvious. Addison sat. Joe placed a printed document on the table between them. "I had this drafted by a financial consultant," he said. Addison looked at the title. "Marital Asset Consolidation Agreement." The phrase itself said enough. Joe tapped the paper. This would move the inheritance funds into a marital investment account. Addison turned the first page slowly. The document described a joint financial structure managed by Joe, a legal framework that would merge the inheritance with their shared finances. Addison looked up. "You've already prepared the paperwork." Joe nodded. "Yes, when last week." Addison noticed something important. The document had been created only days after the dinner, where she refused the investment proposal. Joe had not accepted her answer. He had simply changed tactics. "I'm not signing this," Addison said calmly. Joe's jaw tightened. "You haven't even read the full document." "I read enough." Joe leaned forward. "Addie, this isn't optional anymore." The sentence landed heavily. Addison met his eyes. "What do you mean?" Joe exhaled slowly. "Our marriage is under stress? Because I won't give you control of my inheritance." Joe's voice sharpened. "That's not what this is about." Addison waited. Joe continued. "Marriage means shared decisions and shared finances." Joe nodded. "Yes." Addison looked back at the document. "My father left the estate to me." Joe shook his head. "That's a technicality." "No," Addison said quietly. "It's a legal decision." Joe stood and began pacing across the kitchen. "You're letting your father control our marriage, even after he's gone." Addison remained seated. "My father wrote the will, and now you're hiding behind it." Addison said nothing. Joe stopped pacing. "Mark's project is already delayed because of this." Addison raised her eyes. "You told him he would have the money." Joe hesitated. Then he answered. "I told him we were working on it." Addison understood. Joe had already promised funds he did not yet have. "You created a problem," she said quietly. Joe's voice rose. "We created a problem." "No," Addison replied. "You did?" Joe slammed his hand lightly against the table. "This is exactly what Mom warned me about." Addison looked at him. "What did she warn you about?" Joe hesitated. Then he spoke more carefully. She said grief can make people irrational. Addison almost smiled. I'm being irrational because I won't sign a financial transfer. Joe looked frustrated. You're destroying trust in this marriage. Addison's voice remained calm. Trust doesn't require surrender. Joe stared at her. Then he pushed the document closer. Sign it. Addison didn't move. Joe's voice lowered. If you don't, we're going to have serious problems. Addison finally stood. I think we already do. Joe's expression hardened. You're choosing money over your husband. Addison picked up the document and placed it back on the table. No, she said quietly. I'm choosing responsibility. Joe watched her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen. The bedroom door closed moments later. The house fell silent again. Addison sat back down at the table. The printed document remained in front of her. She opened her laptop. Inside the estate records folder, she created a new subfolder. Legal pressure. She scanned the document Joe had presented, saved it. Then she added a new entry to the timeline. January 6th. Joe presented marital asset consolidation agreement, requested signature. She paused. Then she added another line beneath it. Joe stated refusal would create serious problems for the marriage. Addison leaned back in her chair. Daniel Reeves had predicted something like this. When persuasion failed, pressure increased. What Joe had done tonight was more direct than anything before. But it also revealed something else. Desperation. Joe and Mark were running out of time. Mark's project required money. Joe had promised access to funds that Addison had not agreed to release. And now the situation had reached a point where Joe believed forcing a decision might succeed where persuasion had failed. Addison closed the laptop and looked at the document again. The language was carefully written, professional, structured. But its purpose was clear. It would transfer control of the inheritance into Joe's hands. And once that happened, the legal protections Daniel Reeves had explained would disappear. Addison folded the paper slowly and placed it back on the table. Then she opened the notes application on her phone. Another entry appeared in the timeline. Joe escalating pressure after refusal of investment proposal. She saved the note. The house remained quiet. But Addison Whitfield understood something important. Joe believed he was pushing her toward a decision. What he did not realize was that every step he took, every document he produced, every threat he implied, was becoming part of a record. And that record was approaching a point where it might matter far more than Joe understood. Because when pressure crossed the line between persuasion and coercion, the law began to see things very differently. And Addison Whitfield was no longer the only person observing the situation carefully. Daniel Reeves was watching too. The pressure did not stop after Joe placed the agreement on the kitchen table. It changed form. Over the next several days, the Whitfield family began reaching out more frequently than before. But now the tone was different. The earlier language of opportunity and shared success had been replaced by something more impatient. Addison noticed the shift immediately. The first message came from Mark. It arrived the morning after Joe demanded she sign the agreement. Addie Joe told me you're still holding back on the investment. We're getting close to a critical deadline on the project. We really need clarity. Addison read the message while sitting at her desk at work. She did not reply. Instead, she took a screenshot and added it to the legal pressure folder on her laptop. 20 minutes later, another message arrived. This time, from Carol. Sweetheart, I hope Joe didn't upset you last night. He's under a lot of stress because of the situation with Mark's project. Addison recognized the pattern immediately. Soothing language, but still connected to the same goal. Carol continued. Families support each other during difficult moments. I know Thomas would have wanted you to help your husband succeed. Addison read that sentence twice. Then she saved the message. Her father's name had now become part of the argument. By the afternoon, Joe sent another email. The subject line read, Urgent Timeline. Addison opened it calmly. Addie Mark's construction project is reaching a point where financial commitments have to be confirmed. If the investment doesn't happen soon, the opportunity will collapse. I need to know if you're willing to sign the consolidation agreement this week, Joe. Addison forwarded the email to Daniel Reeves without comment. The response arrived later that evening. Continue documenting. Do not sign anything. Addison closed the laptop. The advice was simple, and it matched exactly what her father had written in his letter. Wait. Let time reveal intentions. That evening, Joe returned home later than usual. He walked into the house carrying his phone in one hand, speaking quietly as he entered. "Yeah," he said into the receiver. "I'll handle it." When he saw Addison in the kitchen, he ended the call. "That was Mark," he said. Addison nodded slightly. Joe placed his phone on the counter. "He's nervous, I can imagine." Joe sighed. "The project is moving forward whether you participate or not." Addison poured herself a glass of water. "Then why keep asking me to participate?" Joe looked irritated. "Because it would solve a lot of problems." Addison studied him carefully. "Financial problems." Joe didn't answer. That silence said enough. Joe leaned against the counter. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Addison remained calm. "I'm making sure it's not a mistake." Joe's voice sharpened. "You're acting like this is some kind of trap." Addison said nothing. Joe continued. "Do you think my family is trying to steal from you?" The question hung in the air. Addison considered her answer carefully. "I think your family wants access to my inheritance." Joe laughed bitterly. "That's the same thing." Addison didn't respond. Joe paced across the kitchen. Mark already committed resources to this expansion. That was his decision. Joe stopped pacing. "You're part of this family." Addison met his eyes. "Being part of a family doesn't erase legal boundaries." Joe shook his head. "You sound like a lawyer." Addison almost smiled. "I've been talking to one." Joe stared at her. "You told Reeves about this?" "Yes." Joe's frustration became visible now. "So now you're bringing lawyers into our marriage?" Addison spoke gently. "I'm protecting my father's estate." Joe pointed toward the kitchen table. "By treating your husband like a criminal," Addison did not raise her voice. "I'm treating the situation seriously." Joe opened his mouth to respond, but his phone rang again. He looked at the screen. Mark. Joe stepped into the hallway to answer. Addison could hear parts of the conversation from the kitchen. "I know. She's still refusing." "I'm trying." His voice lowered further. Addison could not hear the rest, but something about the tension in Joe's voice suggested the conversation was not going well. A few minutes later, Joe returned. He looked tired. "Mark is running out of patience," he said. Addison didn't respond. Joe continued. "He's already promised the investors that the funding would be secured." Addison's voice remained calm. That was premature. Joe ran his hand through his hair. "You're putting me in an impossible position." Addison studied him quietly. "No," she said. "You put yourself there." Joe looked at her for several seconds. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. "If this project collapses, Mark could lose everything." Addison asked quietly, "How much money has he already committed?" Joe hesitated. Then he answered, "Almost 200,000. The number echoed the same amount Mark had asked Addison to invest. Addison understood the implication immediately. Mark's financial situation was far more serious than he had admitted at the dinner table. Joe continued speaking. He used personal loans to secure equipment and investor commitments. Addison nodded slowly. "And now he expects my inheritance to stabilize the project." Joe didn't deny it. Silence filled the kitchen again. Finally, Joe spoke in a quieter voice. "You could fix this." Addison looked at him. "Fix what? The entire situation?" Addison's answer came gently. "It's not my situation to fix." Joe turned away. The conversation ended there. Later that night, after Joe had gone to bed, Addison sat alone at the kitchen table again. Her laptop glowed softly in the darkened room. The timeline document had grown long. Dozens of entries now filled the screen. Emails, messages, financial records, notes from conversations. Addison added 3 more lines. January 8th. Mark requested urgent decision via text. January 8th. Carol referenced Thomas Whitfield's wishes in message. January 8th. Joe confirmed Mark has already committed large financial resources to project. She saved the file. Then she leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen. The pattern had become unmistakable. Joe and Mark were no longer trying to persuade her gently. They were trying to rescue a financial situation that had already begun collapsing. And the inheritance represented their final solution. What they did not realize was that their growing urgency was revealing more information with each passing day, and the more information they revealed, the clearer the entire story was becoming. Addison Whitfield closed the laptop quietly. Her father had been right about one thing above all else. Time revealed intentions, and time was now revealing far more than the Whitfield family had planned. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Daniel Reeves had arranged it after reviewing the documents Addison had been collecting for weeks. He described it simply as a formal discussion to clarify financial boundaries. But Addison understood what it really was. A confrontation. The conference room inside Daniel Reeves' law office was quiet when Addison arrived. A long wooden table occupied the center of the room. A legal pad, a small stack of documents, and a digital recorder sat neatly near Daniel's chair. Daniel greeted her with a calm nod. "Thank you for coming early," he said. Addison took a seat. "Joe confirmed he'll be here." "Yes," Daniel replied. He said his mother and brother would also attend. Addison was not surprised. If the Whitfield family believed they could influence the conversation through numbers, they would bring numbers. 10 minutes later, the office door opened. Joe entered first. His expression was tense but controlled. Behind him came Carol Whitfield and Mark Whitfield. Mark looked impatient. Carol carried the same composed politeness she always used in public settings. Daniel stood to greet them. "Good morning," he said. Joe nodded. "Morning." They took seats across the table from Addison. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel began. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here to discuss the estate left by Thomas Whitfield and the requests that have been made regarding its transfer." Joe leaned back slightly in his chair. "I think the situation has been misunderstood," he said. Daniel folded his hands. "Then this meeting will help clarify things." Mark spoke next. "Look, we're not trying to create conflict," he said. "We just want Addison to consider a reasonable investment opportunity." Daniel nodded slightly. "I understand that position." He opened the folder in front of him. "However, we need to review some facts." Joe glanced at Addison, then back at Daniel. Daniel lifted the first document. "This is the will of Thomas Whitfield." He placed a copy on the table. It clearly states that all estate assets, including the Columbus property and associated financial accounts, transfer exclusively to Addison Whitfield. Carol spoke gently. "We're aware of that." Daniel nodded. "But recent communications suggest attempts to transfer those assets into a joint financial structure." He slid another document forward. "The marital asset consolidation agreement drafted last week." Joe shifted slightly in his chair. "That was just a proposal." Daniel looked directly at him. "A proposal presented with urgency." Joe opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel continued. "In the messages Addison provided, you indicated that refusing to sign the document would create serious problems in the marriage." Joe's expression tightened. "I didn't mean it like that." Daniel made a note on his pad. Mark leaned forward. "Look, the point is, the investment opportunity," he said. Daniel reached for another set of papers. "These bank records indicate that financial transfers from Joe Whitfield to Whitfield Construction Consulting have occurred repeatedly over the past year." Mark stiffened slightly. Joe looked surprised. Daniel continued calmly. 3 transfers totaling $13,500. Mark glanced at Joe. Joe looked uncomfortable. Daniel placed the documents on the table. These payments occurred before Thomas Whitfield passed away. Carol's voice became sharper. What does that have to do with anything? Daniel answered quietly. It establishes that financial pressure existed prior to the inheritance discussion. Silence filled the room. Daniel reached for another document. This is an email sent by Joe Whitfield asking Addison to sign the consolidation agreement within a specific timeline. Joe spoke defensively. I was trying to solve a problem. Daniel nodded. Yes. He looked down at the next page. And according to another message, Mark Whitfield had already committed approximately $200,000 in project funding. Mark's voice rose slightly. That's my business? Daniel met his gaze. It becomes relevant when another person's inheritance is requested to stabilize the project. Joe leaned forward now. You're twisting the situation. Daniel remained calm. No. He slid another document across the table. This is the financial proposal drafted by Mark Whitfield, suggesting the inheritance be moved into a trust managed by Joe Whitfield. Joe glanced at the paper. That's just planning. Daniel looked toward Addison briefly, then back at the others. The concern here is not planning. He tapped the documents. The concern is pressure? Carol crossed her arms. No one pressured Addison. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. He pressed a button on the small recorder sitting on the table. A voice filled the room. Joe's voice. If you don't sign it, we're going to have serious problems. The audio lasted only a few seconds. But it was unmistakable. Joe's face drained of color. Mark looked stunned. Carol stared at the recorder. Daniel stopped the playback. The recording was provided with Addison's consent, he said. No one spoke. Daniel continued. In addition to the audio, there are documented messages from multiple family members urging Addison to move her inheritance into shared financial structures. He looked directly at Joe. That pattern can legally be interpreted as financial coercion. Joe sat back slowly. That's ridiculous. Daniel's tone remained even. Perhaps. He folded his hands. But if this matter escalated into a formal legal dispute, the documentation Addison has collected would become evidence. The word evidence settled heavily over the room. Mark rubbed his forehead. Carol looked angry. Joe stared at the table. Daniel spoke again. The purpose of this meeting is simple. He turned a page. Addison Whitfield's inheritance remains her separate property. He looked at Joe. Any continued attempts to pressure her into transferring those assets could expose you to legal consequences. Joe's voice was quieter now. So what are you saying? Daniel answered clearly. I'm saying the financial discussion ends here. He closed the folder. The estate will remain under Addison Whitfield's control. Mark leaned back in his chair. This is unbelievable. Daniel did not react. Joe finally looked at Addison. For the first time since the meeting began, his voice carried uncertainty. You brought all this? Against me, Addison spoke calmly. I documented what happened. Joe looked away. The room fell silent. After a moment, Daniel stood. If there's nothing further, he said, this meeting is concluded. Carol rose from her chair first. Her expression had hardened. This family won't forget this, she said quietly. Daniel did not respond. Mark followed her toward the door. Joe remained seated for a few seconds longer. Finally, he stood. He looked at Addison once more, but this time he said nothing. Then he walked out. The office door closed softly behind them. The room returned to quiet. Daniel sat back down. You handled that well, he said. Addison exhaled slowly. I didn't say much. Daniel gave a small nod. You didn't need to. Addison looked at the stack of documents on the table. Weeks of conversations, emails, financial records. All of it had led to this moment. The pressure had not disappeared. But something important had changed. The truth had been spoken out loud. And once truth entered a room like that, it was very difficult to pretend it didn't exist. The days after the meeting at Daniel Reeves's office passed quietly. not the uneasy silence that had filled Addison's home before. This silence felt different, final. Joe moved through the house with a careful distance, as if every conversation now required caution. The anger that had once appeared quickly in his voice was gone, replaced by something colder. Resignation. They spoke only when necessary, about groceries, about schedules, about practical things. But the subject that had consumed their lives for weeks, the inheritance, never appeared again. Because after the meeting in Daniel Reeves' office, there was nothing left to debate. The documents had been placed on the table. The messages had been read aloud. The recording had spoken for itself. And the truth had been impossible to ignore. 3 days later, Addison met Daniel again. This time, the meeting was brief. Daniel handed her several finalized documents. "These confirm that the estate transfer is complete," he said. "The accounts are now fully under your name." Addison nodded. "And the house? The deed has been recorded. The property belongs to you." Addison placed the papers carefully inside her folder. Daniel watched her for a moment. "Have you made any decisions about the future yet?" he asked. Addison thought for a moment before answering, "Yes." Daniel waited. "I'm moving into the house." Daniel nodded slowly. "That seems appropriate." Addison stood. "There's one more thing." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm filing for divorce." Daniel did not appear surprised. "Would you like my office to assist with that?" "Yes." Daniel simply said, "We'll begin the process. No dramatic statements, no raised voices. Just another set of documents that would quietly mark the end of something that had already begun to fall apart." The day Addison returned to her father's house felt different from the first time she had unlocked the door after the funeral. The air inside still carried the faint scent of old books and coffee. But this time, the silence felt calm, not empty. Addison placed a small suitcase near the hallway and walked slowly through the rooms: living room, kitchen, study. The desk where her father had once worked remained exactly as it had been. Addison sat in the chair again. For a moment she allowed herself to simply breathe. Everything that had happened over the past 2 months, the arguments, the pressure, the legal meeting, felt distant now. Not forgotten, but finished. She opened the desk drawer and placed the folder labeled Estate Records inside. The timeline, the emails, the financial documents, all of it. She closed the drawer gently. Some records needed to be preserved. But they no longer needed to sit on the kitchen table every night. Addison stood and walked to the window. Across the street, Mr. Howard Green was watering a small row of winter plants near his front porch. He noticed her and raised a hand in greeting. Addison waved back. Life outside the house had continued, while everything inside it had been changing. And now slowly, her own life would begin again. Later that evening, Addison carried a box into the living room. Inside were a few items she had brought from the house she once shared with Joe. Clothes, books, a framed photograph from her college graduation. Nothing more. There were no dramatic arguments when she moved out. Joe had not tried to stop her. Perhaps the meeting with Daniel Reeves had made the situation too clear to dispute. Or perhaps Joe had finally realized that the inheritance had never been his to negotiate. Either way, the separation had happened quietly. The divorce paperwork would follow. Addison unpacked the last item from the box. Her father's fountain pen, the same pen he had used to write the letter Daniel Reeves had given her. She placed it carefully on the desk in the study. Then she opened the envelope again and read the letter one more time. The words had not changed, but they felt different now. Because everything her father had warned about had happened exactly as he predicted. Advice, opportunities, pressure disguised as concern. And time had revealed the intentions behind each of them. Addison folded the letter again and placed it back in the envelope. Then she turned off the desk lamp. Night settled quietly around the house. Outside, the winter air moved gently through the trees. Addison Whitfield stood for a moment in the dim light of the hallway. 2 months earlier, she had stood in a funeral home, surrounded by people who believed she was alone. A grieving daughter. Someone easy to persuade. Someone too quiet to resist. They had mistaken silence for weakness. They had mistaken patience for confusion. But silence, when used carefully, had its own strength. Because silence allowed people to observe, to document, to understand. And when the truth finally arrived, it did not need to shout. It only needed to be shown. Addison walked back into the living room and turned off the final light. Tomorrow she would begin small repairs on the house. New paint, a few changes to the kitchen. Nothing dramatic, just quiet improvements. The kind her father would have appreciated. And when the work was finished, the house would not feel like an inheritance anymore. It would feel like a home again. Addison Whitfield closed the door behind her and stepped onto the front porch. The night air was cold but clear. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something steady inside her again. Not relief, not victory, something simpler. Peace. After everything that happened in Addison Whitfield's life, the ending did not arrive with celebration. There was no public humiliation for the people who had tried to take advantage of her grief. No dramatic confrontation. No victory speech, just distance and dignity. Sometimes justice looks quieter than people expect. It appears in a signed document that restores ownership, in a legal record that confirms the truth. In the moment, someone chooses to walk away rather than continue a fight that no longer deserves their time. Addison did not tell the story publicly. She did not try to embarrass Joe or his family. The evidence she collected served its purpose in the room where it mattered. After that, she simply moved forward because the most powerful response to manipulation is not revenge. It is clarity. And once clarity arrives, some relationships naturally fall away. But something else remains: self-respect, the kind that grows slowly when someone protects what was entrusted to them. Thomas Whitfield had not only left his daughter a house and a savings account. He had left her preparation, patience, and the understanding that careful records can protect the truth when emotions cannot. If you stayed with Addison's story all the way to the end, thank you for being here. Stories like this travel far beyond a single place. So if you'd like, share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always interesting to see how many different corners of the world connect through stories about dignity and quiet strength. And if this story meant something to you, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who say the least. And sometimes the most important victories happen in silence.